Good afternoon, everyone. In the last lecture, we talked about the philosophy of Immanuel Kant, and we saw that he's asking the question, what is the foundation of morality? And he begins, we saw, by saying that it's goodwill and not happiness or virtue, as we've seen in the classical view of, say, Aristotle and Aquinas that we studied previously. But we also saw that happiness is fundamentally changed in Kant. He's taken on the more modern conception of happiness as a simple satisfaction of your desires, rather than a more profound fulfillment of what we are as human beings. And we saw that goodwill is tied to doing our duty or following the law, as Kant says. And this is why we call Kant's system a deontological ethics, a duty-based ethics. And he says doing the right thing only for the sake of doing one's duty and following the law is what's morally praiseworthy. So we get this distinction between acting in accord with duty versus acting from duty. And acting from duty is the target. That's what we're aiming for. Now this means that, according to Kant, we have to deny our inclinations, because he seems to assume that our inclinations will typically be a disinclination towards doing what's right according to the law, doing our duty. And in fact, the actions with the most moral worth are those in which we do the right thing against our inclinations. That's when we really know that we're doing it for the right reasons, he suggests. Now, how do we discover this objective moral law that we're supposed to act by? Well, he says through reason. And this is where we get the notion of that very important categorical imperative, that we're supposed to universalize our maxim for acting and see whether the results work out or not. And this is all done through reason, not the emotions, as Hume had suggested. Well, let's move on to what you read for today. This is our last reading from John Stuart Mill. Now, Mill is living we're all the way up to the 19th century here, believe it or not. He's living from 1806 to 1873, so a much more contemporary thinker. And what he's presenting is what we call utilitarianism, as he himself calls it. Now, this is a highly influential ethical system. In fact, if you were to take a moral philosophy course, an ethics course as it would be called, just like it is here, at a typical college, especially at a big state school, utilitarianism really rules supreme, and there would be a big emphasis on the principles of utilitarianism and some applications of it. In fact, Peter Singer is a contemporary advocate for a version of utilitarianism. Now, some of you might have heard of him. He's fairly well known. He's one of the best known ethicists in the world, in fact, largely because he holds some very extreme views on controversial issues like animal rights and abortion, and his views, enthusiastically in favor of both, are very popular in the mainstream press. So you may see him from time to time, and he's pretty much a straight utilitarian in his own way. Anyway, okay, so Mill begins in chapter 1 by referring to the little progress which has been made in the decision of the controversy respecting the criterion of right and wrong. So here we notice right away the reduction of ethics to the mere question of what is right and wrong. And this captures, as we know, the contemporary understanding of ethics, that it's simply about what's right and wrong, not in the broader sense of human happiness and fulfillment and the other things we've been talking about along the way in the classical view. So Mill notes next that all actions are for an end, and this should sound familiar, right? We've seen this in the classical view. But he also makes it clear that the moral worth of the action has nothing to do with the intentions of the agent, only with what the agent actually accomplishes. So he sounds more like Aristotle and Aquinas here in this focus on the end, but really what he's talking about are the consequences that come from the action. And that's a subtle distinction, but there's a difference there. And it's also a stark contrast with Kant, who, as we've seen, disregards completely the result of the action, what comes about because of what you do. And Kant focuses solely on the intention. So Mill is really turning this around the opposite way. So for Mill, the character of the action, the moral action, is determined by the consequences. And he goes on to say that first principles in moral matters can't be proven. And in this, he's surely correct. He says that these first principles are the roots of the tree of moral thought. And this is true. This is what it means to have first principles, things that aren't things that you can establish, but you don't demonstrate them. Otherwise, there would be something prior to them. And I should note that in this, our last ethics class, this is really the goal of this course, is to give you a variety of starting points for ethical analysis. And if you really understand these principles, you'll then be able to recognize them in moral arguments out there in the world. And you'll also be able to adopt thoughtfully and intentionally the moral principles that make the most sense. And you'll have a more coherent moral thought than most people out there in the world. This is something that's severely lacking, sort of coherent view, not a mishmash of this and that, but serious, consistent moral thinking. Okay, so what are Mill's first principles? Well, you'll notice he refers to what he calls the greatest happiness principle. This states that actions are right in proportion as they tend to promote happiness, wrong insofar as they produce the opposite of happiness. You also notice the jab at Kant on the bottom of page 111 onto page 112. So what then is happiness? Well, let me read a few sentences from page 114 where he states pretty clearly what this is all about. He says, "The creed which accepts as the foundation of morals utility, or the greatest happiness principle, holds that actions are right in proportion as they tend to promote happiness, wrong as they tend to produce the reverse of happiness. By happiness is intended pleasure and the absence of pain. By unhappiness, pain and the privation of pleasure." And then he continues a couple sentences later. He says, "The theory of life on which this theory of morality is grounded, namely, that pleasure and freedom from pain are the only things desirable as ends, and that all desirable things are desirable either for the pleasure inherent in themselves or as means to the promotion of pleasure and the prevention of pain." So here we have it, a very explicit version of hedonism. Pleasure and pain are going to be the judge of what he calls happiness and what we ought to do, how we ought to act. So a reduction of happiness to mere pleasure and pain. So moral action becomes something of a calculation of the pleasure and pain that's likely to be produced by it. Remember his focus on the consequences that we talked about at the beginning. So here you could take a sort of quantitative approach to making this calculation and make it into a quasi-mathematical calculation. And this is exactly what a utilitarian philosopher before Mill had done, and his name was Jeremy Bentham, who is perhaps less well known than John Stuart Mill, but is really the founder of utilitarianism. And he held, as Mill is alluding to here, that quantitative calculation of pleasure is sufficient. So you could assign units of pleasure, as it were. Think about it mathematically. So assigning units of pleasure to the possible choices in your moral situation, in the decision you're trying to make, and choose the option that produces the most pleasure units. Now, this is a bit artificial, but it sort of makes sense, right? It's sort of simple to think about this way. But Mill's view is a little bit different. He doesn't think this quantitative analysis is completely sufficient. He says you have to add a qualitative dimension as well. So the quality of the pleasure must be acknowledged, not just a brute quantity. So now we're faced with a difficult situation, a familiar one. Can we say that one pleasure is better than another? How can we decide? Who decides? Well, Mill's answer seems to be that those who have experience of both kinds of pleasure are the ones that are best qualified to decide. Now, what he's talking about here are what we would call higher pleasures, more refined pleasures, traditionally, and lower pleasures, base pleasures. And we've talked like this before, even in Aristotle. So Mill is going to put the pleasures that correspond with our higher faculties, like our intellect, above the pleasures that apply to us as animals, let's say. So this is not just a sort of sex, drugs, and rock and roll form of hedonism that he has in mind. Mill is staying pretty close to the tradition in his own way. Think about Aristotle and how exalted the contemplative life is, a life of philosophy. And Mill is basically saying the same thing, but he's trying to fit it into this utilitarian calculation. So for Mill, it sounds like reading a great work of literature, for example, something intellectually satisfying, would be qualitatively better than take an extreme example, a 3-day bender of cocaine and alcohol or something obviously base like that. But we have to observe that this is not the case for everyone. Not everyone would agree. And it won't take long for utilitarian thinking to become almost exclusively a calculus of which base pleasures count the same as the higher ones. Now, as you can imagine, this is precisely what happens when moral relativism takes over, and people are no longer comfortable making claims about what's better and what's worse. Now, the final thing we should note is that the happiness calculation that Mill's got in mind doesn't just concern the individual person acting. So this isn't just a private system of morality, it's a public one. And Mill meant it to be that way. So in this way, utilitarians are going to use it to decide questions of public policy as well. And this is in fact what you see in the contemporary world, I would say. But the perennial challenge to utilitarianism in this respect is always going to be that it seemingly gives no reason for rejecting certain actions that would seem to fit favorably into their criteria. And we could think about some extreme examples here to make the point clear. So let's say that you have in custody, say you're the police or the government or something, you have a person in custody for a crime who you know is innocent. Yet the public is outraged at this person and think that they committed this crime. And you have good reason to believe that there's going to be a lot of violent rioting if you let this innocent person off the hook. So by utilitarian calculation, wouldn't it make sense to, say, imprison or even hang or execute this innocent person in order to prevent this violence? How would the life of one person compare quantitatively to the lives of the many people who are likely to lose their lives and their property in widespread rioting? You could take another sort of extreme imaginative example. Let's say a dictator is about to kill 20 people, but says he'll desist if you kill one person. These are the sorts of crazy thought experiments that people like to talk about in ethics classes. It seems clear that the utilitarianism in its bare form here doesn't give us any way of saying that you shouldn't kill this person, because what's the life of one person compared to 20? It seems pretty clear if you just do this as a sort of blind calculation without any other moral principles involved. Finally, we could think of situations like Nazi medical experiments, or even in our own country, military radiation experiments that are, I think that's been shown to have taken place in history, where you experiment on certain subjects without full disclosure of what's going on, or in the case of the Nazis, a forced medical experimentation. So it harms a few people, but what's gained for that harm? Well, a lot of cures for different diseases, a lot of suffering, and a lot of death is obviously being prevented by inflicting some harm on a handful of people. So how can a utilitarian say that that's not the right way to handle that situation? Okay, well, let's leave it there for today. Now, it's been a pleasure to have you in class, so to speak. If you find yourself around Farrell in the fall, be sure to stop by my office. I'll look forward to meeting you in person. And don't forget about the last piece of class we have tomorrow, that is the final exam, and I'll send you an email to remind you. So take care and goodbye.